Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, has long stood at the crossroads of federal policy and urban reality. Nowhere is this more evident than in the city's entanglement with America's war on drugs. From the 1970s to the present day, D.C. has been both a testing ground and a battleground for drug policies that have profoundly impacted its communities, particularly African American residents. This documentary delves into the complex history of the war on drugs in Washington, D.C., exploring its origins, implementations, consequences, and the ongoing efforts for reform. The term war on drugs was popularized by President Richard Nixon in 1971 when he declared drug abuse public enemy number one. This declaration marked the beginning of a federal initiative aimed at eradicating drug use through stringent law enforcement and punitive measures. However, the roots of drug prohibition in the United States trace back to the early 20th century, with laws often steeped in racial and xenophobic motivations. In Washington, D.C., these federal policies had immediate and lasting effects. The city's unique status, lacking full autonomy and subject to congressional oversight, meant that federal drug laws were implemented swiftly and at times without local input. This dynamic set the stage for decades of tension between federal mandates and the lived experiences of D.C. residents. Chapter 2: The Crack Epidemic and its Fallout. The 1980s brought a surge in crack cocaine use across urban centers in the United States, with Washington, D.C. experiencing a particularly devastating impact. The proliferation of crack cocaine led to a spike in violent crime, with the city's homicide rate reaching alarming levels. In response, federal and local authorities intensified their efforts, leading to aggressive policing and the implementation of mandatory minimum sentences. One of the most notorious figures of this era was Rafel Edmund III, a drug kingpin who dominated the D.C. drug trade and became a symbol of the city's struggles. His arrest and subsequent cooperation with the authorities highlighted the complexities of the drug crisis and the challenges in dismantling entrenched drug networks. The aggressive tactics employed during the war on drugs era strained relations between law enforcement and D.C.'s communities, particularly among African American residents. Operations like Clean Sweep involved jump-out squads, officers in unmarked cars who would rapidly deploy to arrest individuals in suspected drug areas. These tactics often led to accusations of racial profiling and civil rights violations. The consequences were profound. Communities felt under siege, trust in law enforcement eroded, and the social fabric of neighborhoods was disrupted. Moreover, the financial and emotional toll on families affected by incarceration was immeasurable. Despite similar rates of drug use across racial groups, African American residents in D.C. were disproportionately targeted and arrested for drug offenses. This disparity was exacerbated by policies like the 100-to-1 sentencing ratio for crack versus powder cocaine offenses, leading to longer sentences for offenses more commonly associated with black communities. These enforcement disparities contributed to a cycle of poverty and incarceration, with long-term implications for employment, housing, and family stability. The systemic nature of these issues highlighted the need for comprehensive reform. In recent years, Washington, D.C. has taken steps to address the legacy of the war on drugs. In 2014, the city decriminalized the possession of small amounts of marijuana, reducing penalties and aiming to alleviate the burden on the criminal justice system. Additionally, there has been a growing emphasis on harm reduction strategies, such as needle exchange programs and the distribution of naloxone to prevent opioid overdoses. These initiatives represent a shift from punitive approaches to public health-oriented solutions. Despite progress, challenges remain. The introduction of drug-free zones and other law enforcement strategies continues to spark debate over their effectiveness and potential for discriminatory application. Advocates argue for the need to address the root causes of drug use, such as poverty, lack of access to health care, and systemic racism. Efforts to expunge past drug convictions and invest in affected communities are seen as essential steps toward achieving equity and healing. The history of the war on drugs in Washington, D.C. is a microcosm of the national struggle with drug policy, law enforcement, and racial justice. As the city continues to grapple with the consequences of past policies, it also serves as a beacon for potential reform. By learning from history and centering the voices of affected communities, D.C. can pave the way for a more just and compassionate approach to drug policy. Raphael Edmund III's power in Washington, D.C. during the 1980s was the result of a perfect storm of timing, connections, strategy, and fearlessness. Here's why he became so powerful. Edmund did something few drug dealers in the U.S. ever pulled off. He established a direct connection to the Colombian Medellin cartel, bypassing middlemen. Most American dealers were paying inflated prices for cocaine passed down through multiple layers. Edmund cut out the intermediaries and began importing multi-hundred-kilo shipments, sometimes weekly, at discounted prices. This gave him a massive pricing advantage and enough supply to flood the entire D.C. area with crack cocaine. Raphael wasn't just a street hustler. He was smart, organized, and ran his drug operation like a corporation. He had lieutenants managing blocks, soldiers enforcing rules, and couriers handling transportation. He kept tight control over inventory and loyalty, treating dealers under him well enough to avoid betrayal, while punishing disloyalty ruthlessly. His charisma and financial savvy allowed him to build an empire quickly, and he did it while still in his early 20s. Raphael rose to power right as crack cocaine hit American cities, including D.C. Crack was cheap, addictive, and more profitable than powder cocaine because it could be sold in small, high-margin quantities. Demand skyrocketed, and Edmund was in the perfect position to dominate supply. As a result, D.C.'s streets were soon flooded with Edmund's product, and his network expanded rapidly. Raphael had serious street credibility and was respected and feared. He grew up in the city and understood the neighborhoods and the game. His enforcers, particularly people like Wayne "Silk" Perry, kept competition and snitches in check with violence. At his peak, it was said he had hit squads and eyes on every block of the city. He was also known to be generous in the community, giving money to kids and sponsoring local sports, creating a kind of Robin Hood image in some neighborhoods. The D.C. government and law enforcement were under-resourced and often compromised in the 80s. There were rumors of cops being paid off or scared into silence. D.C.'s criminal justice system couldn't keep up with the scale of violence and distribution. Edmund was able to operate almost openly, with many in the city knowing who he was, even attending high-profile events like Georgetown basketball games with players and celebrities. Raphael was young, flashy, and charismatic, the face of the new wave of urban kingpins. He wore designer clothes, drove luxury cars, and hosted extravagant parties. His lifestyle made him a legend, admired by many, feared by others. He wasn't just another dealer. He became a pop culture figure in the streets, and the feds took notice. Raphael Edmund was powerful not just because he sold drugs. He industrialized the game. He created a blueprint that blended the street hustle with corporate structure, cartel-level supply chains, and media-worthy visibility. But that power came at a cost. His empire left devastation across D.C., and he eventually paid with a life sentence in federal prison. Tony Lewis Sr. was the right-hand man to Raphael Edmund III and played a crucial role in the operation of Edmund's massive drug empire during the 1980s. His job was essentially to run the streets, while Raphael maintained higher-level connections with suppliers and handled strategic decisions. Tony Lewis Sr. managed day-to-day operations. Here's a breakdown of his role. Lewis oversaw the distribution network across multiple neighborhoods in D.C., particularly in areas like Northeast and Southeast. He coordinated with lieutenants who handled specific territories, ensuring product moved smoothly and sales were maximized. He was known for maintaining tight discipline in the operation. Disloyalty, theft, or sloppy work was not tolerated. Tony ensured that rules were followed and that everyone, from couriers to sellers, stayed in line. Raphael was flashy and high profile, but Lewis operated with more discretion. His trusted relationship with Raphael was key to the network's strength. He helped vet new people, maintain internal security, and keep the organization functioning like a machine. While not a triggerman like Wayne "Silk" Perry, Lewis was not above using force when necessary. He helped coordinate protection for key players and ensured enemies didn't interfere with business. Tony Lewis Sr. was arrested and sentenced to life without parole in 1989. He declined to cooperate with law enforcement even when others did. His loyalty made him a legend in the D.C. streets, but it also meant he never came home, unlike some others who turned state's evidence. Raphael Edmund, Rafel Edmund III's uncle, played a critical behind-the-scenes role in building and maintaining the international supply chain that fueled Raphael's drug empire. While Raphael was the face of the organization in the streets of D.C., Ralphie was the connect, the plug, the gateway to the Colombians. Here's a detailed breakdown of Raphael Edmund's role. Raphael was instrumental in establishing the direct link between the Edmund organization and the Medellin cartel in Colombia. He arranged deals that allowed hundreds of kilos of cocaine to be brought into D.C. at once, cutting out traditional middlemen and giving Raphael massive control over price and supply. Raphael helped manage the logistics for importing cocaine from Colombia into the U.S., often through Miami or other East Coast ports. He coordinated with couriers, pilots, and transporters who brought in multi-million-dollar shipments under the radar of law enforcement. Though older than Raphael, Raphael trusted his nephew's street sense and business hustle. He acted as a mentor and strategist, helping to scale the operation into one of the most powerful urban drug enterprises in the country. Unlike Raphael, Raphael avoided the limelight. He wasn't flashy, didn't attend big events, and stayed behind the curtain. This helped him stay off law enforcement radar longer than his nephew and many others in the crew. Eventually, law enforcement identified Raphael as the cartel connector and indicted him along with Raphael and other key players. His arrest helped cut the pipeline to Colombia, which crippled the flow of drugs and contributed to the collapse of the Edmund Empire. Ralphie Edmund wasn't on the corner, but he was pulling major strings behind the curtain. Without Raphael's connections to Colombian suppliers, Raphael wouldn't have had the volume or prices to dominate D.C. the way he did. Raphael turned what could have been a local crew into a multi-million-dollar criminal organization with international reach. Little Melvin Williams was a major drug figure in Washington, D.C., long before Raphael Edmund rose to prominence. While Little Melvin didn't directly work under or alongside Raphael Edmund, his legacy and influence in D.C.'s heroin trade during the 1960s and 1970s helped lay the foundation for the type of criminal empire Raphael would later build. Here's how Little Melvin's story connects to Raphael Edmund's era. He was called the godfather of D.C.'s heroin trade. In the 1960s and early 70s, Little Melvin Williams ran one of the largest heroin operations in the Mid-Atlantic. He was known for being strategic, disciplined, and business-minded, traits that influenced younger hustlers like Raphael Edmund, even if indirectly. Williams operated with mafia-like structure and discipline. He maintained control over territory, had enforcers, and was known to handle both business and enforcement with precision. His dominance created a blueprint for organized drug enterprises in D.C. When Raphael's generation came up, they looked to guys like Little Melvin as legends. By the time Raphael took over the streets in the 1980s, Little Melvin was already serving time in federal prison for heroin distribution and RICO charges. The two operated in different drug eras, Melvin was the heroin kingpin of the 60s and 70s. Rafel ruled the cocaine and crack era of the 80s. Even though they didn't collaborate, Little Melvin's reputation was so big that his name still carried weight in D.C. during Rafel's reign. Some members of Rafel's network admired or studied how Melvin structured his empire. His rise, fall, and eventual redemption arc also served as a cautionary tale. After his release, Little Melvin became a minister and motivational speaker. He even made appearances on The Wire, portraying a deacon, a symbolic return to the streets, but this time to help rather than harm. While Little Melvin Williams wasn't directly involved in Rafel Edmund's operation, he was one of the original kingpins of D.C., and his impact on the city's criminal underworld undoubtedly influenced the environment that allowed Rafel's empire to rise. Think of Little Melvin as the OG, and Rafel as the next-generation hustler who took the blueprint and scaled it with new drugs and bigger connections. Philip "Fat" Jones was a key lieutenant in Raphael Edmund's drug empire, one of the trusted insiders who helped keep the operation running smoothly across Washington, D.C. While not as well known as Rafel, Tony Lewis Sr., or Wayne Perry, Fat Jones played a significant behind-the-scenes role in managing the streets and ensuring the organization's product moved efficiently and securely. Fat Jones was one of Rafel's top distributors, overseeing multiple street-level crews who sold crack cocaine in Northeast and Southeast D.C. He ensured that product was distributed quickly and reliably to dealers across the organization's network. Trusted Inner Circle member Rafel only kept a few people close in the inner circle. Fat Jones was one of them. He was loyal, discreet, and reliable, which made him essential in keeping the day-to-day operations under control, while Rafel focused on big-picture moves like working with the Colombians. Fat was involved in handling large amounts of money, managing pickups and drop-offs, and making sure cash flowed back up the chain without theft or disruption. He was part of the team that kept records, inventory, and street-level reports in order. Rafel's empire was sophisticated and required coordination similar to a Fortune 500 company. While not as violent or feared as Wayne "Silk" Perry, Fat Jones had a reputation for holding things down when problems came up, especially in hostile territories. He ensured that disloyal or sloppy workers were handled, either by cutting them off or escalating matters up the chain. Jones was indicted and arrested along with other members of the Edmund organization when the feds brought a sweeping case in 1989. He received a lengthy federal prison sentence, but, like many in Rafel's crew, refused to cooperate with authorities, earning him respect among loyalists of the old D.C. street code. Philip "Fat" Jones was one of the core operators in Raphael Edmund's drug empire. He managed crews, moved weight, and handled cash while staying loyal and under the radar. His quiet but solid presence helped hold the infrastructure of the empire together. He wasn't flashy or feared like Rafel or Perry, but his role was just as essential. Wayne "Silk" Perry was Raphael Edmund III's chief enforcer, the man who brought violence, fear, and protection to the Edmund drug empire in Washington, D.C. during the 1980s. While others managed distribution, logistics, or street-level operations, Perry was responsible for eliminating threats, enforcing discipline, and making sure no one crossed the organization. Perry's job was to protect the empire by any means necessary, which often meant murder, intimidation, and violence. He developed a reputation as a cold-blooded killer who took out rivals, snitches, or anyone who posed a risk to Edmund's operation. Some reports attribute more than a dozen murders to Perry, and witnesses were too scared to testify against him for years. Perry wasn't originally part of Edmund's crew, but joined as Rafel's operation grew and needed serious muscle to protect its turf. He was considered extremely loyal to Rafel, treating him like a younger brother and ensuring his safety at all costs. Their bond was strong, and Edmund relied on Perry to take care of problems that couldn't be handled by negotiation or influence. In D.C., Perry was feared and respected. Mentioning his name alone would make people back off. He was untouchable for years due to his street smarts, brutal efficiency, and the fear he instilled in both enemies and allies. His nickname Silk came from his smooth demeanor, but his actions were far from soft. In the early 1990s, Perry was arrested and charged with multiple murders and RICO violations. When Raphael Edmund turned informant in exchange for benefits in federal prison, it reportedly devastated Perry, who never flipped. Perry was ultimately sentenced to life without parole, landing in the federal supermax prison, ADX Florence. To this day, Perry's name carries weight in D.C. street lore. He's seen by some as a tragic figure of loyalty and violence, while others see him as a ruthless killer who fueled the devastation of the crack era. He has given a few prison interviews, often discussing betrayal, loyalty, and the dark life he led. Wayne "Silk" Perry was Raphael Edmund's most feared associate, a street soldier turned enforcer who made sure the empire stayed protected and unchallenged. Without Perry, Raphael's reign would have been far more vulnerable to threats, inside and out. His role was simple but crucial: handle the bodies, enforce the rules, and protect the boss. The investigation that brought down most of the major drug kingpins during Washington, D.C.'s crack era was a massive, multi-agency federal operation involving the FBI, DEA, ATF, and local D.C. police, and it culminated in a sweeping series of indictments in 1989. It was one of the largest and most aggressive drug investigations in D.C. history, and it marked a turning point in the city's war on drugs. By the mid-1980s, Raphael Edmund was making an estimated $2 million per week, and his crew was responsible for a huge percentage of the crack cocaine in the city. His empire stretched across almost every quadrant of Washington, D.C., employing over 100 people at its peak. Federal authorities began to build a case as early as 1985, but the scale and sophistication of his operation made it hard to penetrate. The investigation gained steam through the use of electronic surveillance, including court-authorized wiretaps on phones used by Raphael and his top associates. Agents recorded hundreds of hours of conversations, which included code words, drop instructions, and discussions about supply shipments from Colombian cartel contacts. Some from inside the organization began cooperating with law enforcement. One of the biggest breaks came from individuals who flipped under pressure, often due to the threat of lengthy prison time. Federal agents also followed money trails, luxury purchases, and travel records, which painted a picture of high-level trafficking. In April 1989, federal authorities unsealed a 41-count indictment against Rafel Edmund III and 11 of his top associates, including Tony Lewis Sr., Philip "Fat" Jones, and Raphael Edmund. The charges included drug trafficking, conspiracy, money laundering, racketeering, and multiple firearms violations. The investigation revealed that the Edmund crew had direct links to the Medellin cartel, making them one of the few U.S. groups with that kind of international access. After Raphael's arrest, law enforcement turned its attention to his violent enforcer, Wayne Perry, who had evaded prosecution for years due to fear on the streets. In 1993, Perry was charged with 5 murders and several attempted murders, tied directly to his work for Edmund and other dealers like Alpo Martinez. He was convicted and sentenced to life without parole in federal prison. By the mid-1990s, most of the major kingpins from the D.C. crack era were behind bars for life, many due to the federal government's use of RICO statutes and tough sentencing laws. The streets saw a temporary drop in centralized control, leading to smaller crews and more chaotic violence in some areas. The aggressive prosecutions were hailed by some as necessary to curb rampant drug violence, but others argued they disproportionately targeted black men and led to mass incarceration. Mandatory minimums and harsh sentencing left little room for rehabilitation or second chances. The Marion Barry scandal is one of the most infamous chapters in Washington, D.C.'s political and drug history. Barry, the city's charismatic and controversial mayor, was caught on tape smoking crack cocaine in a 1990 FBI sting operation, which shocked the nation and exposed the intersection of politics, drugs, and power in the nation's capital. Here's a detailed breakdown of the scandal and how it connected to the broader drug scene. Marion Barry was a civil rights activist turned politician known as Mayor for Life in D.C. for his incredible popularity, especially among black residents. First elected mayor in 1978, he was re-elected in 1982 and 1986, becoming a symbol of black political power in a predominantly black city. In January 1990, Barry was set up by an ex-girlfriend and FBI informant named Hazel Diane Rashida Moore. The FBI filmed him in a hotel room at the Vista International Hotel, where he smoked crack cocaine from a pipe just minutes before being arrested. The infamous line, "Bitch set me up," became a symbol of both his defiance and the sting's political complexity. The FBI had been investigating Barry for years amid rumors of drug use and corruption, but couldn't get hard evidence until Moore agreed to work with them. Critics have argued the sting was politically motivated, meant to publicly humiliate a powerful black mayor during a peak moment in the war on drugs. Barry's drug use became symbolic of the chaos and contradictions of the crack era in D.C. While young black men were being locked away for decades for even small amounts of crack, the city's mayor was using it in hotel rooms and still kept his political career. There were persistent rumors that Barry socialized with or turned a blind eye to known drug dealers, and he reportedly met Rafel Edmund on at least one occasion. But no credible evidence has ever surfaced proving he was directly involved with any D.C. drug crews. Some speculate the federal government saw Barry as soft on drugs, especially given D.C.'s explosion of violence during his tenure.